Why did surgeons spend over 40 years cutting people awake, while the gas that could spare them was sold as a party trick? Why did several men reach for it at once? This is the story of a bottle of laughing gas, an operating room where legend and record split apart, and a queen who called the cure a blessing. A woman sits upright in a plain wooden chair. She is awake. Her hands grip the arms of the chair, and there are other hands on her shoulders, holding her still. The year is 1811. The city is Paris. The woman is a novelist named Frances Burney, Fanny to the people who love her. And she has a tumor in her breast that her doctors have told her will kill her if it stays. So they are going to remove it. Now, in this chair, with nothing to dull what is about to happen. She was not a young woman. She was nearly 60, one of the most admired writers in England, a woman who had dined with kings and held her own in the sharpest rooms of her age. None of that mattered now. She had been given a wine cordial to steady her, and that was all there was. There was no chloroform, no ether, no injection, no mask. None of those things existed yet, as far as anyone in that room knew. There was only a long steel blade, a folded handkerchief laid over her face so she would not see, a circle of men, and a body that would feel every second of what came next. She had spent weeks dreading this moment, and the dread had its own cruelty, because no one would tell her when it would happen. She was given barely a few hours' notice, and then they came. She lived. The operation worked, and she survived it by almost 3 decades. But she could not let it go. 9 months later, she sat down and wrote the whole thing out, in a long letter to her sister Esther, because the memory kept returning, and she thought that setting it on paper might finally lay it to rest. It did not. The account she wrote is one of the most precise descriptions we have of what it was to be operated on while fully awake. Not because she wanted to horrify anyone, but because she was a writer, and a writer's instinct, even in agony, is to find the exact words. One line of hers has outlasted nearly everything else she wrote. She said, "The scream she let out lasted the entire time of the incision, that she almost marvelled it did not ring in her ears still, all those months later." She wrote that the worst of it was not the first cut, but the long middle of it, the minutes, not the second. This was not a horror story to the people in that room. This was a Tuesday. This was simply how surgery was done, for almost everyone, for as long as anyone could remember. If a serious cure required a knife, the price of that cure was being awake for it, and feeling it, and surviving it. Everyone in that room knew that. Bernie knew it, the surgeons knew it. No one present thought there was another way, because for the whole of human history, there had not been one. And there was one thing she did not know, sitting in that chair with the handkerchief over her eyes. She did not know it, and almost no one alive did. The thing that could have ended her pain, that could have let her sleep through every minute of it and wake with the tumor already gone, had already been sitting on a shelf, written down and published for 11 years. There is a version of this story where the men who did these operations were monsters. Butchers in bloodied aprons, deaf to the screaming, hardened past caring, sawing through the living the way a carpenter saws through wood. It is the version the imagination reaches for, because it is the easiest one to hold. And it is wrong. The surgeon directing Fanny Burney's operation was one of the most famous in Europe. He had made his name on Napoleon's battlefields, where he had organized the care of the wounded with a speed and a humanity that were genuinely new. He is one of the reasons we have anything like battlefield medicine at all. He worked faster than almost anyone alive because he had to. And he was known, this is the part the monster version leaves out, for his tenderness toward the men under his knife. By Burney's own account, when the moment came to begin, there were tears in his eyes. Sit with that. The man about to cut into a conscious woman's chest was weeping as he did it. That detail matters because it tells you what kind of problem this actually was. The surgeons of that era were not, as a rule, callous. Many of them hated the pain they caused. The profession had built around itself an entire ideal. The surgeon as a man of feeling, a man who suffered alongside his patient, who felt the cut in his own nerves and steeled himself to inflict a necessary cruelty precisely because he was not indifferent to it. To be unmoved was considered a failing. The good surgeon was the one who minded and cut anyway. So the pain was real. The agony was real, and the men holding the knife knew it and grieved it and did it regardless, because they believed, correctly, that the only alternative to the suffering was the death of the patient. You could be cut and scream and perhaps live, or you could keep your peace and die of the thing inside you. Those were the choices. In that light, the screaming was not cruelty, it was mercy's price. And because they could not take the pain away, they did the only merciful thing left to them. They got faster. In London there was a surgeon whose whole legend was speed. He could take a man's leg off, skin, muscle and bone, in about 2.5 minutes. He was known for telling the gallery to time him, for the flash of the blade, for the way an amputation that might take another man 10 unbearable minutes took him 150 seconds. In a world with anesthesia, that sounds like vanity, like a circus act. In a world without it, it was nothing of the kind. It was kindness, measured in seconds. Every second the blade was faster was a second less the patient spent awake inside the worst experience of a human life. There was a grim arithmetic to it, and everyone understood the sum. Speed was the only painkiller anyone had, and so the great surgeons trained themselves to be quick the way a great musician trains to be precise. Which leaves a question hanging over the whole period, the question this entire story turns on. If everyone hated this, if even the surgeons hated it, if the most celebrated men in the field were measuring their mercy in seconds because seconds were all they had, then why was there nothing better to reach for? Why, in all those centuries of clever, careful, anguished men, did no one find a way to simply make the patient sleep? The strange answer is that someone had. There was something to reach for. It worked, and people knew it worked, and you could see it working with your own eyes any night of the week. It simply was not in the operating room. It was at the fair. Before we leave that chair, stay in it one more moment. What was at stake there is the thing the rest of the story turns on. Being cut awake was not only pain, though the pain was the heart of it. It was helplessness of a total kind. The patient's one job during surgery was to hold still, to keep the limb or the body motionless so the blade could do precise work. And because no human being alive can hold still while being cut, the patient's real job was to be held still. There were men in the room whose entire role was that: to pin the arms, to lock the legs, to keep the head from thrashing, to bear down with their whole weight if they had to. The surgery was a thing done to you while you were conscious by a group of people who had agreed in advance that it was necessary and that no amount of your begging or screaming would or should stop it once it had begun. To go under the knife was to surrender your body to other people's hands in the most complete way imaginable. And the imagination again wants to soften this by making it rare, a thing that happened to a few unlucky souls. It was not rare. This was the toll of serious surgery, all of it. A tumor like Bernie's, a leg shattered under a cartwheel, a bladder stone that had grown until it had to come out, a childbirth gone wrong where the only instruments were sharp ones. If the body needed to be opened, the opening happened while the person inside it was awake to feel it, from the first cut to the last stitch. There was no other way. In all the long history of medicine, there had never once been another way. Which is why the belief underneath it all was so total that no one ever bothered to say it out loud, the way you do not announce that water is wet. Pain was not a problem to be solved. Pain was the cost of being saved. It was simply built into the nature of healing, like the scar that came after. Everyone knew that. No one questioned it. To find the thing on the shelf, you have to leave the hospital entirely and walk into a very different kind of room. A travelling show, a lecture hall hired for the evening, a tent at a country fair, a crowd that has paid a few pennies at the door to be entertained. The entertainment was a gas. You would take your seat, and a showman would step out and give a little speech about the marvels of modern chemistry. And then he would invite volunteers up onto the stage and let them breathe from a bag or a bladder of the stuff. And then the whole audience would watch ordinary, respectable people go completely strange. They would laugh helplessly at nothing. They would stagger and reel and lurch into the furniture. They would make grand speeches or burst into song or swing their fists at the empty air, or simply sit down on the floor with a beatific look on their faces and feel, by every visible sign, absolutely nothing. They would crash into a bench hard enough to leave a bruise the size of a fist and not so much as flinch, and only discover the injury later when the gas wore off and the show was over. That was the entertainment, that a person could be hurt and not feel it. This was a recognized, popular form of fun on both sides of the Atlantic for decades. There were two substances that did it. One was a gas, first produced in a laboratory in 1772, which people came to call laughing gas, for the obvious reason. The other was a liquid whose vapor did much the same thing, a substance first cooked up by a chemist in 1540, almost 3 full centuries before any of this, and noted even then, at the very beginning, to put animals into a deep sleep. 300 years. The vapor that could send a creature into unconsciousness had been sitting in the world's knowledge since before Shakespeare was born. People did not use it to sleep through surgery, they used it for parties. They called them frolics. Young men and women, medical students especially, would gather of an evening and pass the bottle around and breathe the vapour and lose themselves for an hour, the way another generation might pass around a bottle of wine. It was a little daring, a little scandalous, and entirely ordinary. The exact substance that could have spared Fanny Burney every second of her agony was, in those same years, the centrepiece of a good night out. 2 rooms, then. The same city, the same decade, perhaps the same week. In one of them, a person is being held down on a table and cut open while fully awake, screaming, while a weeping surgeon works as fast as his hands will move, because there is nothing on earth anyone in that room can do to spare them. In the other room, a few streets away, a person is breathing a gas that has switched off their pain so completely they could be cut and not know it. And a paying crowd is laughing at the spectacle because it is a show. It was the same gas, and one man had already noticed. In the year 1800, in the city of Bristol, a chemist of 21 sat down and wrote a book about that laughing gas. He had been breathing it himself, studying what it did, trying to map its effects on the body and the mind. His name was Humphrey Davy, and he would go on to become one of the most celebrated scientists of his century. But this was early work, a young man's treatise, hundreds of pages long, on a single gas. And buried inside it, almost in passing, is one sentence. He wrote that, since the gas appeared to be capable of destroying physical pain, it might probably be used with advantage during surgical operations in which no great effusion of blood takes place. Listen to how careful that is. He does not say, "I have found the answer." He does not say, "Surgeons, use this." He says it might, probably, be of some advantage, and only in operations without much bleeding. It is a guess, a hedge, a young man's aside, tucked into one corner of a long book, written in the most tentative language he could choose. But it is there, in print, in 1800. The idea that you could switch off the pain of surgery, written down and published, and available to read. Davy wrote that in 1800. The next time anyone reached for one of these gases to spare a surgical patient, the next time a doctor said, "Let us put this person to sleep before we cut," was the early 1840s. That is more than 40 years. Remember the shelf from the very beginning, the one Fanny Burney did not know about in 1811? Davy's printed line was already 11 years old when she sat down in that chair, and it kept sitting there, untouched, for another generation after her. Children were born in 1800 who grew up, married, had children of their own, and grew old. And in all that time, the printed suggestion that surgery did not have to hurt was read and set down and left alone. The gas did not change in those years. The chemistry did not change. The book did not go anywhere. You could take it off the shelf and read that sentence the whole time. Something else was missing, and whatever it was not knowledge. So why did it wait? You can list reasons, and they are all true, and not one of them is the answer. The gas was a toy, so serious men did not take it seriously. Giving the right dose was genuinely hard, and getting it wrong was frightening. Surgeons were busy and proud, and not in the habit of taking medical advice from showmen and chemists. But every one of those is a symptom. Underneath all of them sat a single belief, the one we have been circling since the first chair. The belief that the pain of surgery was simply part of surgery, not an obstacle, not a flaw, a fact of the world, like gravity. You did not try to abolish it for the same reason you did not try to abolish the cold of winter. It was the price, and you do not go looking for a way out of a price you have never once thought of as optional. The barrier was never the chemistry. The barrier was that no one had yet decided pain was something a person was even allowed to refuse. And then, almost all at once, several people decided exactly that. What happens next is the part of the story that looks, at first glance, like a race. Several men, in the space of a few years, each arriving at the same discovery. It is tempting to line them up and ask who got there first, who deserves the credit, who won. Resist that. Because the most important fact about these men is the one the race story hides. They did not know each other. They were not competing. They were scattered across a continent and an ocean, working alone, mostly unaware that anyone else was working on the same thing at all. This was not a relay, with one runner handing off to the next. It was something stranger. It was the same idea occurring to different people independently in the same handful of years, after sitting available and ignored for 2 generations. That pattern is the whole of the thing, and it is worth keeping in view as the men go by, one after another, reaching for it alone. It starts in rural Georgia in 1842. A country doctor named Crawford Long had been to the ether frolics himself. He knew what the vapor did, he had felt it. And he had noticed something at those parties that no one else seemed to find remarkable. People who knocked themselves about while under the gas felt no pain from it. So when a young man came to him wanting a tumor cut out of his neck, Long soaked a towel in ether, had him breathe it, and removed the tumor while the man lay there feeling nothing. It worked. The first surgery in history performed on a patient deliberately put to sleep. And it worked. And then Crawford Long did almost nothing about it. He used it a few more times, he told a few people. He did not publish a word about it for 7 years. He was a careful man in a remote place, and he wanted to be sure. And so the first man to end surgical pain on a patient went back to his practice and kept the discovery nobody had asked him for. The same year, somewhere else entirely, a medical student pulled a tooth painlessly using ether, and his professor told him it was a foolish idea, and he dropped it. One more person reaching for the same thing in the same year and being talked back out of it. And in Hartford, 2 years on, a dentist named Horace Wells went to a laughing gas show for the evening. He watched a volunteer crash into a bench hard enough to gash his own leg open and stand there, bleeding, laughing, feeling none of it. Wells did not laugh. He went home turning it over, and the very next day he had one of his own teeth pulled while breathing the gas and felt nothing. He understood in that moment exactly what he was holding. So Wells took it to Boston, to a room full of medical men, to show them what he had found. It went wrong. He had a patient in the chair, and he gave the gas, and he pulled the tooth, but the gas was taken away a moment too soon, and the patient cried out. And the room, full of professional men who had come prepared to be unimpressed, decided they had been. They called it a humbug, a fraud, a trick. Wells left that room a man who had been laughed at. That word, humbug, is going to come back. Hold it. Now stand back and look at what just happened across those few years. A country doctor in Georgia, a student waved off by his professor, a dentist jeered out of a hall in Boston. 3 men, and there were others, in different places, not in contact, each one independently reaching for the same idea that had been lying in plain sight, unused, for 2 generations. When one person stumbles onto something, that is a discovery. When this many people stumble onto the same thing at the same time, after it's sat available and ignored for 40 years, it is telling you something different. It is telling you the thing that changed was not the gas. The gas had been ready the whole time. What changed was that the world had finally become ready to reach for it. The problem was never the solution, the problem was permission. And permission, it turns out, arrives for everyone at once. 2 years after that room in Boston laughed at Horace Wells, a man who had once been his business partner walked into the same kind of room with a different gas and a different result. Boston, the 16th of October, 1846. The operating theatre of the Massachusetts General Hospital, a steep wooden amphitheatre, tiers of benches rising around a single table, packed that morning with doctors and students who had come to watch. The man with the gas was a dentist named William Morton. He had been a partner of Wells, and he had moved on to ether. The patient was a young man named Edward Gilbert Abbott, with a growth on his neck. The senior surgeon was one of the most respected in the city, a man named John Collins Warren, and Warren, who had surely heard how the last demonstration in this town had gone, had every reason to expect another humbug. Morton gave the ether. Abbott went under, and Warren took up his knife and cut into the neck of a sleeping man who did not move, did not cry out, did not feel it. When Abbott came back to himself, they asked him what he had felt, and he said he had felt no pain, only, he said, a sensation like that of scraping the part with a blunt instrument. Think about where that sentence sits in this story. The same scraping that Fanny Burney, awake, called a knife rattling against the bone, Abbott, asleep, barely registered as a dull pressure he could describe with mild curiosity. That is the whole revolution in one patient's report. And here is what the senior surgeon wrote in his private journal that evening, the man who had just performed the most important operation of his life, on the day the thing happened. He wrote, "Did an interesting operation at the hospital this morning while the patient was under the influence of Dr. Morton's preparation to prevent pain." An interesting operation. That is what he called it. That is the entire record in the hand of the man who was there of the morning surgical pain was beaten. Now, there is a line you may already be waiting for. If you know this story at all, you know that someone, in that room, supposedly turned to the watching crowd and announced that this was no humbug, a triumphant cry the moment the doubters were proven wrong, the sentence that gets put on the plaques and into the films. Here is what the record actually shows. That line appears in no account written on the day. None. The first time it surfaces in print is in 1859, 13 years later, in a biography. The eyewitness recollections that supposedly back it up did not appear until 1896, 50 years after the morning it was supposedly said. A careful forensic review of the evidence concludes the famous line may never have been spoken at all, and if some version of it was the surgeon who said it, not the dentist everyone credits. So the most famous sentence in the history of surgery is, as far as the documents can tell us, something a later generation needed to be true. They had a mercy on their hands, and a mercy needs a hero, and a hero needs a line. So one got written, and repeated, and carved into the legend, until it became more real than the quiet entry in the surgeon's own notebook. And the man with the gas did not help his own legend. Within days, William Morton patented the process. He gave the ether a secret name, a brand, and refused to say what was in it so that he could control it and charge for it. The medical world was appalled. You could not, they felt, put a private lock and a price tag on the end of human suffering. The man pop history would crown as the selfless discoverer spent the day after his triumph trying to own it. The record of the day surgical pain was conquered is one flat sentence in a surgeon's notebook. The legend, the cry, the hero, the triumphant moment was built afterward by people who needed a clean story for a mercy the world had spent more than 40 years refusing to reach for. The practice itself, though, did not wait for the legend. Within weeks it crossed the Atlantic. In London that December, the surgeon famous for speed, the man who had taken legs off in 2.5 minutes because speed was the only mercy he had, performed Europe's first operation under ether, a leg amputation. And the patient, who by every prior law of that room should have been screaming and held down, simply slept through it. The fastest knife in Europe had built his whole life around outrunning pain, and here was a gas that did not outrun it, but erased it, and made his great gift, his speed, almost beside the point. He is said to have remarked, watching it, that this American technique beat hypnotism hollow. The old world conceding in a single dry sentence. That fast, that complete. And you can feel the story wanting to end here. The pain is beaten, the doubters have conceded, the gas is crossing the world, a clean victory. It was not clean. Within 15 months of that London amputation, the conquest had its first recorded death. Her name was Hannah Greener. She was 15 years old. She lived in a village near Newcastle, and she went under chloroform, one of the new agents, for an operation to remove an infected toenail. A toenail. And under the anesthetic, something went wrong in her body, and she died on the table. The first person on record killed by the thing that was supposed to spare her. And in that same month, an ocean away, in a prison cell in New York, Horace Wells died. The man jeered out of that Boston hall years before had never recovered. He had kept experimenting on himself with the new gases, breathing them again and again until he was addicted, until the chemicals had taken his judgment and then his mind. In a state of intoxication, he had thrown acid at 2 women in the street, and he had been arrested, and now he sat in a cell, understanding what he had become. He took his own life there. And the cruelest detail is in the timing. Just days after his death, a medical body in Paris moved to honor him, to credit Horace Wells formally as a pioneer of the conquest of pain. The recognition he had been jeered out of a room for chasing arrived. He was already gone. A belief that strong does not die without taking something with it. The world had decided at last that pain could be refused, and almost immediately the refusing began to cost lives. The 15-year-old, the disgraced dentist. The price of breaking the belief was paid in the same coin the belief had always demanded. Human suffering, only now redistributed. And the deepest the old belief ran was not in the operating room at all. It was in the room where people are born. In Edinburgh, in the autumn of 1847, an obstetrician named James Young Simpson was trying to find something better than ether. So he did what the chemists and the showmen had been doing for 50 years. He and 2 colleagues sat around his own dining table after dinner and breathed the vapours of one liquid after another to see what they did. They tried a new one. And the next thing any of them knew, they were waking up on the floor, having slid clean out of their chairs. They had found chloroform. Within days, Simpson was giving it to women in childbirth. And that, childbirth, is where the old belief made its last and deepest stand. Because here, the argument was not only that pain was the price of a cure. Here, some argued, the pain was holy. That the pain of childbirth had been ordained, set down in Scripture as part of the natural order, and that to take it away was to defy a sentence God himself had passed. Simpson, who was a religious man himself, answered them on their own ground. He pointed to the scripture they were quoting from, to the very beginning of it. In the story of the first man, he noted, before God took the rib to make the first woman, God first cast the man into a deep sleep. The first surgery in the oldest story they had was performed, Simpson argued, under an anesthetic, administered by God. It was a clever answer, and it did real work. It would be too much to say it swept the objections away. The resistance was never as organized or as total as the dramatic version of this story likes to claim, and pockets of it lingered for years. But it helped. It gave the doctors and the mothers who wanted relief a way to want it with a clear conscience. It accelerated the turn. And then the most watched patient on earth settled the matter without arguing it at all. In 1853, Queen Victoria gave birth to her 8th child, and for that birth her physician administered chloroform. The Queen, who could have had anything, who answered to no one, who was as close to the will of God as a person could stand in the eyes of her subjects, chose to be spared the pain. Afterward, she wrote in her journal that the chloroform had been soothing, quieting, and delightful beyond measure. Delightful. The word matters. A generation earlier, the pain of birth was a sentence to be endured. Now, the woman at the very top of the world called its absence a delight, in writing, for everyone to read. And that did more than any pamphlet could. Royal approval was as near to divine approval as the age could imagine. The thing about a belief is that you cannot see it while you hold it. It just looks like the way things are. Within this one woman's lifetime, the assumption that the agony of being cut or of giving birth was simply the price of the body, an assumption that had stood for the whole of human history, had quietly become something almost no one believed anymore. It did not feel like a revolution. That is how the deepest revolutions feel, like common sense arriving late. The room where it happened is still there. The same steep wooden amphitheatre in Boston, the same tiers of benches rising around the same floor where a sleeping man once did not feel the knife. You can stand in it. It is quiet now. Cleaned, preserved, empty, a century and a half after the morning the belief broke in it. The men who broke it mostly came to bad ends. The dentist who gave the famous demonstration spent the rest of his life fighting over the credit, fighting in the courts and the newspapers, and before Congress for the money he felt he was owed, and he died in 1868, broke and bitter, the mercy he had helped bring into the world having brought him mostly grief. The chemist who insisted the discovery had really been his lost his mind in the years of fighting and died in an asylum. The war over who deserved the credit outlasted almost every man who fought it. And that endless, unwinnable war is itself the last piece of evidence for the thing this whole story has been saying. There was no single discoverer to crown, because there was never a single discovery to make. What each of them reached for, separately, was permission. You cannot patent that. It does not belong to one man because it never came from one man. Because the thing that changed in this room was never the chemistry. The chemistry had been sitting on a shelf for more than 40 years, published, available, readable the whole time. What changed was not what people knew, it was what they believed they were allowed to refuse. The screaming is over. The room remains. And the empty benches leave one question hanging in the cold light. The chemistry, in the end, was the easy part. The hard part was believing the pain did not have to be there, and that took 2 generations, while the answer waited in plain sight. Somewhere, on some shelf, in some plain language nobody is reaching for, there may be a mercy we are still walking past, because we still believe it is simply the price.